Welcome to episode 50 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode in the show notes, and that's at www.7, so all spelled out, SEVEN, health.com/50.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. This is another show where I'm flying solo and covering a specific topic of my own, and this week's topic is the blue zones. So in 2004, Dan Buettner teamed up with National Geographic and the world's best longevity researchers to identify pockets around the world where people live measurably longer lives. And in these areas, they found people who were reaching the age of 100 at rates 10 times greater than in the US and in the UK. And these areas became known as the blue zones. And the places that were identified as part of the blue zones are Sardinia in Italy, Okinawa in Japan, Nicoya in Costa Rica, Icaria in Greece, and then Loma Linda in California with a group of 7-day Adventists. And as part of research, they identified 9 different principles that all of these areas or groups had in common that supported their long lives. And what I want to do as part of the podcast today is go through these different principles. And just so you know, these findings have also been independently seen in lots of other research outside of just the blue zones. So for each of these different principles and points, I'm going to expand on them and share other ideas around them and other research that goes on to support them. So the first principle of the blue zones is to move naturally and to move regularly. And when you look at the blue zones, and pretty much when you look at any traditional societies or tribal societies, movement is a big part of their life, and constant low-grade movement. And this is stuff I've talked about before, but I think it's really important because so much of what we focus on these days when we think about movement is exercise. So going to the gym, lifting weights, doing a spin class, doing CrossFit, but even when someone's doing that regularly or even a lot, they may be doing it 5 or 6 hours a week. And for most people, they're not even getting close to this. So what's then going on for the rest of the time? We as a society have never exercised like we do now. Gym memberships as a percentage of the population is much higher. People doing formal exercise as a percentage of the population is much higher. I mean, you go back to not that long ago, the 1950s, 1960s, people just didn't exercise like they do now. I mean, especially if we're thinking about the female population, it just wasn't the done thing. But never before in history also have we then been so sedentary and had life really so physically easy. Again, going back just as far as the 1950s and 60s, but then going back for history forevermore, life was filled with constant low-grade movement, like making a meal, washing clothes, doing farming, even working in a factory. So much of the day-to-day was filled with constant movement. And there's an acronym known as NEAT, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And this is all the energy that is expanded from everything that we do that is not sleeping, that is not the energy we use to digest our food, and is the energy not the energy that we use for sports like exercise. So it ranges from energy expended for, say, walking to work or doing typing or performing some yard work or just standing, being in the shower, brushing your teeth. If you have a mini vegetable patch or a garden or doing that, sitting at your desk and fidgeting, any tiny little movement is part of this NEAT. And movement really is important for our health. But hitting it hard 4 or 5 days a week at the gym and then spending the rest of the time being very sedentary, it really doesn't get you very far. And the thing that really makes a difference from a health perspective is the NEAT, or the low grade movement that is done fairly consistently. And this isn't to say that you shouldn't be exercising, because you really should, and it does definitely provide health benefits. But exercise should be thought about as like the cherry on top when you're doing the NEAT. And if you're not regularly doing that low grade movement, then this is where people should be starting. And I know there's nothing particularly sexy about saying you should do some gardening or you should go for a walk. And people are unlikely to get the abs or look buff or the ripped physique that so many people are really wanting as part of this. But if you're looking at it from a health perspective and from a happiness perspective and from a longevity perspective, like constant low-grade movement is really the crucial part. I would add that sitting is an independent risk factor all on its own. So even if you're doing lots of movement, even if you are doing exercise, if you're having very long times where you're sitting and you're being very sedentary, this can still cause a problem. So if your job is one that requires for you to be at a desk, see if you can be spending more of your day working while standing up. Like, I know you can get treadmill desks that some people want to do. For other people, like just standing would be a very good start. Getting like some books to lift up your laptop if you don't want to go down the route of actually getting a standing desk. I know for me, working at home, I have a very, very regular desk. And I have a stand for my laptop, and when I want to be standing, I then just put books under it and I can work in that way. For a lot of people, even that's not doable because of their office environment. They don't feel comfortable doing it, or they hot desk, or for whatever reason, it's just not appropriate. And you can actually, if this is the case, get a little stepper that you put under your desk that you can then move while sitting. And it's the problem with the constant sitting is that you have muscles that are sitting very flaccid and staying that way for a really long time. And so if you have something like a stepper where you're constantly moving your feet under your desk while you're working, this can at least minimize a lot of that. And if you're then every hour getting up, doing a little walking round, getting a glass of water or just stretching and then getting back to it, that can really minimize any of the damage from that long time spending sitting. So have a look on Amazon and see if you can find something like that to put onto your desk if that's the only viable option that you have. One thing I would also add to this is, like, wherever possible, people should be doing sort of exercise or movement outside. And we spend now so much of our lives and so much of our times indoors, and this really isn't how we've evolved. And I'm going to do a podcast shortly all about the importance of sunlight and how different spectrums of light have different functions to play within our health. And I briefly touched on this before when I did an episode on sleep, but I want to go into this in much more detail. So yes, movement is really important, and when looked at as part of the blue zones, it's really important. But for them, they were living in a traditional lifestyle, and so much of this movement was beneficial because it was also happening outside where they're getting that really good natural light, and not just the light, but they're spending time in nature, they're getting fresh air. And so, look, this isn't always going to be doable for everyone, and I get that people have busy lives. They also often live in cities. But the more time you can be incorporating where you're in nature and you're outside and then you're doing some kind of walking or some kind of movement, then I think this can be really important for helping with overall health. So the second principle that was identified as part of the blue zones is knowing your purpose in life. So the Okinawans call it the Ikigai, and the Nicoans call it Plana de Vida. And both of these terms that I've just butchered there translate into why I wake up in the morning. And all of the other blue zone areas as well have like purpose really at the heart of their lives. And I think this can be a slightly trickier one for people. And for a lot of the areas in the blue zones or as part of that, they're still living a very simple and traditional life. And I think there's definitely something to be said for this approach, but most people don't live in this kind of simple way. And it's very easy to know your purpose in life if you're a farmer, everyone you know is a farmer, you're living in a very traditional way, everyone values being in a family, all of those. So there is this purpose that is just basically automatically built into your life. It's a very different situation now where really people can live in very, very different ways, and you can literally do and be whatever you want. So I often find that for people these days, it can be much more difficult. And getting hung up on the idea of what is my purpose is also something I see going on. And this can then be really stress-inducing because it's so easy to focus on other people who seem to be achieving so much, and yet you're just struggling even with the idea of like, what's my purpose? What should I be doing? So I want to offer a couple of ideas here. The first one is that your purpose in life may change as you go through life. Yes, there are going to be people who do the same thing throughout their whole career. They knew what they wanted to do since they were 10 years old and they've always done it. But for other people, their purpose will have different iterations at different points. So for 10 years, they put their focus into this one thing. For another 10 years, they're doing something else. Then for the next 12 years, it's something different. And if this happens, it's often easy for people to think that like, I'm directionless, I don't have a purpose, I'm like flip-flopping in what I want to do in life. And this definitely isn't the case. You can have different purposes at different points throughout your life. The second idea I want to mention is that your purpose doesn't necessarily have to be anything big. Like, it's really easy to look at people who are doing incredible things in the world and really feel deflated. Like, not everyone is going to be a Sir Richard Branson or a Dame Helen Mirren or something like that. Like, your purpose can be something very small in comparison, but that doesn't make it any less important. So it can be, I want to have my purpose be to be bringing up kids. I want to have my purpose to be running this small business. I want to have my purpose to be some creative task that you enjoy doing and you take real satisfaction in it. Like, it doesn't have to be you trying to take on the world and save the world. What I would say though is whatever you decide that you want to make your purpose, like, my suggestion is to go for mastery with this thing. So people who dabble in things like rarely achieve spectacular results. And it's also hard to feel that something is your purpose if it's just like something you will do occasionally. So whatever it is, like if you want to spend time like thinking about it and figuring it out, or if you already know, like whatever that thing is, that purpose is, have a desire to become an expert in that thing and really like get involved in it and go all in. Another way of thinking about this, and a fantastic example of the importance of purpose, is a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So Frankl was a Jewish doctor and psychotherapist, and in 1942 he was sent to a Nazi concentration camp. And in the book he details how he was able to get through his experience there. And he was actually at a number of different camps throughout the war, and he worked as a doctor in the camp. And he was trying often to help his fellow inmates. And he would often see how many of them really decided that they'd had enough and that they'd give up and that they would die within a day or 2 or 3 from starvation as part of that. And through seeing this, he decided that something good had to come out of this totally terrible experience. And that if he gave in, then it would all be in vain. But if he was able to keep going and to make it out, he would find a way to benefit from what he'd been through. And he was determined by this real desire to find meaning in all forms of existence, even the most brutal ones that he was experiencing at the time. And he managed to survive, and he went on to write a number of incredibly important and successful books and to create a whole new area in psychology, in psychotherapy. And undoubtedly, he was lucky to survive in the camps when others didn't. But his sense of purpose was a huge part of this as well. And it is a very harrowing book to read, but it is one I would definitely suggest checking out. I also recently did a podcast on creating happiness, and in it I talked about the work of Dr. Seligman, and he talks about as part of his book, Authentic Happiness, that there are 3 different happy lives. One's about experiencing the nice things in life and appreciating that. One's about like engagement and getting into flow. And the third is about helping others. And both engagement and helping others can be part of someone's purpose. So spending time, and my suggestion is to like spend some time thinking about your own values, your passions, your signature strengths, and how these can then be used as part of your sense of purpose and your reason for getting up in the morning. And something that really pulls you towards this rather than having to push yourself. And so in the show notes, I'll include a link for the previous podcast on happiness. I'll also include a link to the book, Man's Search for Meaning, and then some other books that I'm going to talk about as part of this. So the third principle that the Blue Zones identified is that they know how to relax and how to unwind. And it's not that they just know this stuff intellectually, but they do it daily and they make it a priority. So the Okinawans, they take a few moments each day to remember their ancestors and everyone who'd fallen before them and what had happened. The 7-day Adventists would pray. The Icarians, they would take a nap in the afternoons, and the Sardinians would have a happy hour. And stress leads to chronic inflammation, and it's associated with nearly every major age-related disease. And working out ways to manage this by relaxation and unwinding is really important. But for so many people, when I look around these days, they're constantly working on the go. Like with emails and social media and you constantly having this stuff on the phone, like the line between when someone is working and when someone is not working has become blurred, and people find themselves checking email as soon as they wake up or just before going to bed or even waking up in the night. But also the way that people choose to relax has also changed a little bit. And the notion of like switching off now can be about looking at a screen and looking at a phone, and that's not always the most helpful thing. And so I find that the notion of really switching off and really unwinding when people are honest about what they do is a very foreign idea. Or when they do decide to unwind, the things that they choose to do actually pushes them further away from health. So for example, someone decides that they're going to watch TV, they end up watching TV until midnight, and in the beginning it may feel relaxing, but the likelihood is that this is going to negatively affect their sleep, and it then leads to worse health outcomes. Or other people who work really hard through the week and it feels like they've earned themselves the weekend, and so they spend their weekends going out, having late nights, lots of drinking, lots of things that mean that they wake up tired, and then they roll out of bed on Monday morning and it feels like they need another week off. And so I always say to people, like, the week doesn't earn you the weekend earns you the week. Like doing things on your weekends or doing things when you have downtime that then allow you to do the rest of the week, as opposed to when you have those moments off, doing things that basically destroy you and put you in a worse place to then be able to do the things that you have to do in terms of work, etc. So when working with clients, one of the big things that I focus on is self-care. And what are the things that you can be doing that take care of yourself on a daily basis, and not just like when life gets stressful or you're feeling run down, but all the time. Because I find that self-care is the thing that comes up like when someone's hitting rock bottom or when everything is falling apart, but no one gives it the attention that it really should be getting when things seem to be going well. So I'll get clients to write down a list of things that fall under the bracket of self-care for them. And this can range from things that are totally inconsequential, or at least feel inconsequential, that are really minute, through to really big things like, I don't know, going away, having a spa weekend away, or just going on holiday. And these are the kinds of things that they can't obviously do every day or fairly regularly, but can be a priority at different points of the year, and making sure that those things do happen at different points of the year. So some of the examples could be things like meditation or visualization, getting someone to take a lunch break and make that a regular practice and get outside as part of that, getting a massage or going to a spa, catching up with friends, and that's hopefully in real life and going out for meals or going for walks or stuff with friends. But it could be for people who are overseas, it could be doing Skype sessions and catching up with friends that way, reading, listening to music, doing some stretching or some yoga, doing drawing, playing an instrument or some kind of other creative hobby. Like, all of these can fall under the bracket of self-care and getting people to start to do them on a regular basis. And as I said, not just when things go bad, but all the time, so that things don't go bad, or when they do go bad, you're in a much better place to be able to deal with them. So the next idea, or the fourth idea that were discovered as part of the blue zones, is that you should eat until you are 80% full. So not stopping when you're still very hungry, but not waiting to stop until you are completely stuffed, or doing what a lot of people do, which is like cleaning their plate with whatever is being served for them. This idea of stopping when 80% full is an idea I'm slightly hesitant about. And the reason I say this is because I work with a lot of clients with disordered eating, and they restrict and they over-exercise. And so the idea of stopping at 80% full can often be used as a way to justify certain behaviors that they keep up. So if this is your background, then I would say maybe be careful with this stuff, or maybe ignore this one. What I would prefer to suggest instead of the 80% full mantra is for people to be mindful when they eat. So not be watching TV or be working on their laptop while they're having a meal, but to be conscious about the meal that they're eating, to be slowing down and to be chewing food properly, and to be taking the time when they eat. And as the meal is going on, for people to be doing it in a manner so that they can be regularly checking in with themselves and saying, okay, where is my hunger levels? Am I still hungry as part of this meal? Do I need to continue eating, or am I hitting that point of fullness? And people can do some of the things that are regularly talked about. Like, you can use smaller plates. You can start with smaller portions. Like, all of these are great ideas, and there is lots of research around how different environmental factors that most people just don't even think about or pay attention to can impact on the amount of food that they eat. But I honestly believe if people can be slowing down and just being more conscious with their eating, then this can often take care of a lot of the other issues. And as I said, this is something I really focus on with clients. And it's not just people who are at the disordered eating end of the spectrum where it's restriction. It's also at the other end of that spectrum where there can be a lot more of the emotional eating going on and people having binge eating episodes, etc. And so just getting that awareness around what's going on to get them to be conscious about what they're eating and how they can set up their meals and their eating structure to give that the best chance or best outcome. And so I regularly recommend the book Intuitive Eating to clients, and I think it's a really great resource. It looks at some of these ideas I've just talked about here in much greater detail and helps people to get back to listening to their body, listening to their hunger and fullness signals, rather than just relying on like dieting and arbitrary rules. I've done a whole podcast on intuitive eating, so I'm going to link to it in the show notes. There's just a couple of things I want to just add extra here in regards to this principle. For those who are in the blue zones, over-consuming of food is much less common, and I think it's less common for a number of reasons. Like, the first is to do with the palatability and the reward that someone gets from eating. The foods that they're eating is like fresh foods that are no doubt like tasty, but they don't like pack the same punch as someone who is eating out at a restaurant or getting fast food, or even in a lot of cases versus what you can make at home, given how you have a supermarket that you can stock your shelves with basically an endless supply of pretty much anything that you want. And this is very different from someone who's living in a very traditional way, who's got to follow the seasons, who've got to just eat what is local and what they've been able to grow themselves. And this then links into the second part, which is due to repetition. these people are largely eating very similar meals basically all the year round. And like there will be seasonality, but the variation within these say different seasons when going from meal to meal is going to be pretty small. Like the lunch that you have today is going to be the same one you have tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And so if you're eating what would be described as more low reward food in terms of palatability and how that affects our brain chemistry when we eat it, and you're having the same meal again and again and again, in those situations, it's much easier to stop at 80% full, to notice your hunger signals and not getting to that like overeating, because there isn't the same excitement around eating food. And this isn't to say that they're not enjoying it, but it's a different level of excitement. And so I definitely think there's some wisdom that we can then take from this. And that's not to say you have to become very monotonous with what you eat and just eat things that are very boring. But having very simple meals and keeping food on the low reward side of things in a lot of cases can then be helping out with this. The fifth principle of the blue zones is that they eat a diet that includes lots of plants. And this is supported by lots of other research as well. So when they do a meta-analysis, so this is where they combine a large amount of different studies and then they combine the results across all of them to see what they find is going on, what are the common themes as part of that analysis. What they find is that at a population level, we can do very well on a wide range of diets. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you as the individual can then do well on each and every diet. But what it does mean is that when someone says that low carb is best or paleo is best or being vegan is best, like this isn't actually supported by studies. What they do find when they look at this kind of analysis is that the diets that contain the highest amounts of food coming from plant sources will typically do the best. So that's high amounts of fruits and vegetables and beans and pulses and those kinds of things. And this doesn't mean that you have to be vegan or vegetarian. You can still eat meat and fish and other animal products while still eating large amounts of plant foods. And I know most people have heard the mantra of having 5 a day and that you should have 5 fruits and vegetables a day to be healthy. And I really think that this is a good starting point. But going higher than this can also have further benefits for people. So, for example, there was a new study that looked at happiness levels and fruit and vegetable intake. And so this was a pretty massive study. There were 12,000 people as part of it. And they found that the more vegetables and fruit that people ate, the happier they became. And the ceiling where this like maximum effect occurred was actually at 8 servings a day. So going past that 5 a day, going up to 6, 7, 8, people could get even more benefits in terms of their happiness. And this study obviously looked just at fruits and vegetables, but there's also other research looking at things like beans and lentils. And so with the blue zones, like they included, depending on which ones we're talking about, lots of things like fava beans or black beans or soybeans or lentils. And these were really the cornerstones of the diets of people who are reaching 100 and more. And this finding has also been found when looking at other studies with like beans and pulses and how they're regularly included in diets and how beneficial they can be. I'm aware that not everyone does well in this stuff. So there are clients that get gas and bloating when they eat certain kinds of beans or really all beans. Some clients as well don't do so well on raw or lightly steamed vegetables. And some of this is coming down to their inherent digestion. Some of it's coming down to the state that they're in at the time in terms of like beans and pulses. Like some of it's coming down to how it's been prepared. But realistically, if you get a reaction when you eat that stuff and you don't digest it very well, then you probably should steer clear of it for the time being. If you can tolerate that stuff, then you should really be including in your diet because you are going to get some benefits from it. There's a quote by the food writer called Michael Pollan that states, "Eat food, not too much, mostly plants." And it's a simple saying, but it contains a huge amount of insight. And even if we're outside of just plants, the foods that should largely be part of someone's diet are the things that are on the outer parts of the supermarkets. So fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, cheese, like minimally processed foods that have been around for millennia. And people always wanting to know, like, what is the best diet? And there's a new diet book released pretty much daily, and each one is always promising spectacular results and explaining why this is the one true path and all of the other ones aren't as good as this one. But really, if I was to sum up what the best diet is for someone, it has to have two important characteristics. The first is that it is sustainable. Like, eating in a certain way for a couple of weeks or even a couple of months has very little bearing on your health and longevity if we look like 10, 20, 40 years down the line. But if you keep something up for 10 or 20 years, this does have a huge impact on health and longevity. And this is why I'm just not a fan of extreme diets and practices. Because even if they do work, which like 99% of the time they don't, someone has to be able to keep it up. So even if it's working, most of the time people can't keep up those extreme practices. So for me, I would recommend, and this is what I do with clients, is I get them to make small changes and go about it in a piecemeal fashion. So get them to make 1 or 2 changes and keep it up for a couple of weeks. Once these have become easy, add in another 1 or 2 things. Do it in a consistent manner that feels doable and is not overwhelming. And this way, when like 6 months time rolls by, a year rolls by, you'll be amazed at like the changes you've made and what you're now doing. And it will feel no harder than what it used to be like when you were doing the less healthy habits, because you've built it in this little piecemeal way. The second factor for a healthy diet is one that actually supports health, because you can keep something up for a long time or it can be sustainable in a sense, but that doesn't necessarily make it healthy. And there can be lots of individuality with this stuff. Like your friend or your partner may do very well following a vegetarian diet or a low carb diet. And if that generally supports them, then that's great. But just because it supports them doesn't mean that it's going to support you. And this is typically what I help people figure out, because a lot of what people are doing on paper can often seem quite sound. And they're eating lots of home-cooked food, or they're following the advice that they read in a magazine or on blogs, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't work for them. And in a general sense, if people can listen to their body and not follow advice blindly because some book or blog told them to do so, then this will lead to better results. But I also know that this is a lot easier said than done. But really, the more people can stop moralizing food choices and becoming attached to certain eating ideologies around what is and isn't healthy, and instead start to listen to their body's feedback and looking at what are different symptoms that are going on, like I think that can lead people in a better direction. So the next principle as part of the blue zones is to drink alcohol in moderation. So people in all of the blue zones drink alcohol moderately and regularly. The exception here are the 7-day Adventists from Loma Linda who don't drink alcohol at all. But to make this work, you need to look at how it is then consumed. Like having 1 or 2 glasses per day and you're consuming it with friends or you're having it with food. This is how it is done within the blue zones. Like you can't save it all up for the weekend and have 7 drinks on Friday and 7 drinks on Saturday. And there is research to show that typically moderate drinkers will outlive non-drinkers. But there are some parts to this that I want to address. And the first is that while moderate drinkers outlive non-drinkers at the population level, this doesn't necessarily mean that it will have that impact for you. Or at least it won't have that impact for you right now in all circumstances. There are times when alcohol isn't good for someone's health because of what they're currently going through. So if that's the situation, like cutting it out would be the healthier option, despite what the statistics show. For other people, moderate drinking just isn't an option. Like they don't do moderation. And I really do think that problems with alcohol are a real issue, and often an issue that's not talked about enough. Because alcohol is legal, or because it's an acceptable drug, these problems regularly go unnoticed. And while many people may not identify themselves as an alcoholic, they have a relationship with alcohol that is unhealthy and it is affecting their health. And so for these people, maybe at some point they're able to find some sweet spot where they are a moderate drinker. But honestly, for a lot of them, this just isn't the case. And often trying to walk that tightrope of becoming a moderate drinker or being a moderate drinker just keeps spiraling them back into heavier consumption. And so if this is the case, then I would say ignore what the research shows about moderate drinkers outliving non-drinkers, because even if it makes like a tiny difference of having some alcohol in terms of it being a positive effect, the consequences of, say, someone getting it wrong and having much, much more alcohol and that having the spiral effect, it then leads to much worse outcomes. And so when you weigh up the pros and cons, it's just not worth it. And for this person, they're not able to be a moderate drinker. So they're either able to be a non-drinker or a heavy drinker. And if you have to choose between the two of those, then a non-drinker is going to be in a much better situation. Another thing I would say, just in terms of the findings with the blue zones and alcohol consumption, is that a lot of this information is based or heavily weighted towards the Sardinians. And the Sardinians typically have 1 or 2 glasses of red wine. But it's not just any red wine. It's wine that is locally grown in Sardinia using Continental grapes, which contain like staggeringly high amounts of antioxidants. They're farming this stuff in very good, rich soil, so this is adding to it as well. So you drinking a glass of wine from a bottle that you picked up that was on special at Tesco's on the way home from work probably isn't going to have the same impact. Yes, you may get some benefits from it, but it's going to be much less than what these centenarians are experiencing in Sardinia from drinking this really beautiful wine that is very homemade, that is using specific grapes that are very high in specific antioxidants. And look, I've been to Sardinia and the place is absolutely beautiful. And I was there with my sister. It was probably like 6 or 7 years ago. And every day we would go for lunch and we'd go for dinner and we'd have some wine with our meal. And we would always just go for the house wine, which was the local wine. And it was always like beautiful. And normally if you're out at a restaurant and you go for house wine, it is pretty ropey. It's not great. But really every place that we went to when we were over there, it was lovely. And I obviously have no idea how high these particular glasses of wine I was drinking were in certain antioxidants. But I do remember thinking when I was there and looking at the landscape and experiencing the food culture, the climate, seeing the way that they live, like it didn't seem surprising to me that these people were living much longer lives. So the 7 principle that came up as part of this research is putting loved ones first. So for the blue zones, this means often keeping aging parents and grandparents either nearby or even in the same home. So you have generation after generation living in the same home. There is also much more of a commitment to having a life partner and someone that they stay married to or with for their entire life. There's a real investment in terms of children, both in terms of time and in love given to those children. And not everyone has either A, the ability, or B, the desire to have multiple generations living in their home under their roof. And not every marriage is going to last a lifetime, and often they do end in divorce. So for this one, I just want to mention 3 things. The first is something really simple, which is that putting family first in this way can often tie back into having a sense of purpose, which was the second principle on the list. So looking after and providing for children or for a partner can be someone's reason for getting up in the morning. And this isn't just about like providing in the sense of providing money or making food, but providing in terms of being supportive and nurturing and like attending to their needs. And the second point is that this principle, for me anyway, is more about relationships than family per se. And one of the biggest contributors to health and happiness and longevity is solid relationships. And this is relationships that you have with a partner, but also with siblings and family and your wider community. And I've talked about this before, but I want to go through it again because it is like one of my favorite bits of research, and I do think it's super important. So this advice has come from a study done by Harvard called the Study of Adult Development, and it's like this fascinating 75-year-long longitudinal study that is still going today. And the study started back in 1938. There were two distinct groups of participants as part of it. 268 were men who went to Harvard College, and they were sophomores at Harvard College between 1939 and 1944. The other group were 456 12 to 16-year-old boys who'd grown up in inner city Boston, and they were described as disadvantaged non-delinquents. So really two very different groups of people coming from very different backgrounds who went on to lead very different lives. And as part of the study, every 2 years, the men were interviewed and were asked about their home life, their work life, about their health. The researchers would get their medical records from the doctors. They would also do their own blood tests and run tests themselves. They would do brain scans on these guys. They'd come into their homes. They'd videotape them talking to their wives and their kids and interacting. About a decade ago, they started to then involve the wives as part of the project, and they're tracking them too. They started to follow the kids and the children of these couples and involving them as part of the study. So this is happening every 2 years. You've got all of these different men and now families, and they've been doing this for 75 years. So you can imagine that there is a ton of information that they've been able to collect. And when they look at this, the thing that comes up the most is healthy relationships. So the men in both groups, so whether we're talking about the Harvard group or the inner city Boston group, those who reported being closer to their families, to friends, or to community tended to be happier and healthier than their less social counterparts. And they also tended to live longer. In comparison to this, people who said that they were lonelier reported feeling less happy, and they also had worse physical and mental health. And relationships are tricky. They're not always going to be perfect, and they don't have to be. And what the study showed was that it's very normal to have ups and downs, to have times of arguments, to have bickering, that kind of thing. But despite these moments, if people at their core truly felt supported and could count on their partner or other friendships in times of need, then this didn't take a toll on their health. And the people who were the most satisfied and happy with their relationships at age 50 were then the healthiest at age 80. And the strengths of these relationships were a much better predictor of health than really anything else. And in fact, when they looked at those who were the healthiest at 80, and then they went back and had a look at their cholesterol and their other blood work and all of that kind of thing, that strong and healthy relationships were a much better marker and predisposed them to good health rather than just their markers in terms of blood work. And to quote Robert Waldinger, who is the director of the study, society places a lot of emphasis on wealth and leaning into our work. But over and over these 75 years, our study has shown that the people who fared the best were the people who leaned into relationships with family, with friends, and with community. So the third thing I want to mention in this section is the whole idea of family first came up in Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers. And he talks about a place called Roseto in Pennsylvania in the United States. And it takes its name from Roseto Valforte or Valfortor from Italy. I'm probably getting that name wrong, but that's my best pronunciation. And so the inhabitants, who were originally from Roseto in Italy, then came over to Pennsylvania, set up the town over there, and then gave it the exact same name. And so doctors were then in the 1950s and 1960s were really amazed to find that people in Roseto who were under 65 were rarely having heart attacks. And this was a time where cardiovascular health, heart attacks had started to become a real problem. And it wasn't just the heart attacks. They weren't having ulcers. People there weren't committing suicide. Like, people were dying of old age, and that was really it. And when they started to investigate the phenomenon, the results were really surprising because the Rosetos ate no better than most Americans. They did do a little bit more cooking within their home, but that was about it. They were heavy smokers. They did very little exercise, or no more exercise than your average American. They were also suffering largely with obesity. But despite all of these different factors, they were still living longer and they were staying disease-free for longer. And the reason for this better health was the town itself. Everyone knew each other and would stop and chat. They would cook for one another. 3 generations would be living under the one roof, and they would all eat together and live together properly. They had this real strong egalitarian ethos. They had a real strong sense of community, strong sense of purpose. They were healthy because of the values of Roseto. So whether it is family first or it's just focusing on healthy relationships, this can really lead to better health. One side note just before I move on to the next principle is I've just mentioned Malcolm Gladwell there. I am completely enamored by the guy and just love all of his books. He has a new podcast called Revisionist History that I highly, highly, highly recommend that you start listening to. I've posted about a couple of episodes on my Facebook page, but really so far all of the episodes have been really strong, and I just encourage people to subscribe and to check it out. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes, but really if you just go into Google and search Revisionist History, it will come up. So the 8th principle actually ties into the one I just went through, and it is having the right tribe. So this is having a tight-knit group of friends or community that can provide you with support. So everything I've just talked about also links into this principle. One of the things that they did identify as part of the Blue Zone research that focused on this part of it was looking at that right tribe and how this helped in relation to people's habits and in terms of their standards. If you are surrounded by friends who regularly exercise, who regularly eat well, who regularly do the things that support your health, you are more likely to do the same thing. And there's a famous quote by Jim Rohn that states, "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." And this is really what this principle is about, surrounding yourself with people who make healthy choices and who are happy. And so that these habits and these states feel very natural to you, feel very much the norm, and so you start doing them without thinking. So the final principle that was discovered from the Blue Zones was the importance of belonging to some faith-based community. And all but 5 of the 263 centenarians interviewed in the original Blue Zone areas all belonged to some faith-based community. And it didn't matter if they were Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or Jewish or really any other religion. What mattered was that they attended regularly with church and that they really felt part of a larger group. And research shows that attending faith-based services 4 times per month will add 4 to 14 years to life expectancy. I don't think that this necessarily is a belief about God, but more to do with the community that someone gets from, say, attending church and the morals that people get that's being provided by this religion. And I know that not everyone wants to go to church, that not everyone believes in God. I don't. So my suggestion with this stuff is to regularly do things that are about helping and serving others. So some kind of charity work or some kind of way that you can then give back, so that you can see that there's more to life than just you, and that you should be helping and supporting others. And to be doing things or surrounding yourself in a way that then creates good morals or creates really high standards that you're then able to keep up, the same way as the church is able to do this, or whatever religious community is able to do this for the people in the blue zones. You can then be getting those same results even if you don't want to be going to church. There's two recent documentaries that come to mind when I'm thinking about this stuff. Both of them are on Netflix, so if you're a member of Netflix, you can find them there. The first is called I'm Not Your Guru, which is all about Tony Robbins, who is a self-help guy. It was made by the filmmaker Joe Berlinger. He's done some really great films like Brother's Keeper, Some Kind of Monster, which was a Metallica documentary, which I've subsequently watched, which is amazing. He did 3 documentaries called Paradise Lost, which was all about the Memphis 3, so the 3 guys who were falsely imprisoned, about some murders that had taken place. So yeah, really, really skilled filmmaker, documentarian. And so what he did in terms of with Tony Robbins is he followed him as part of one of his events and followed him as part of this 6-day seminar, looking at like how and why he does what he does. And look, I've been a really big supporter and big fan of Tony Robbins' work. It's had a real impact on my life. It's something I regularly recommend with clients. And watching a documentary like this is, if you want to see someone who is about serving others and what this can really look like, I really suggest watching this documentary and seeing what can be done. The other documentary, which is on a slightly different tip, is something called Dishonest, The Truth About Lies. And it looks at the research done by Dan Ariely, who is a professor of psychology and a behavioral economist. Geez, I'm really having struggle talking today. And it is like truly fascinating. And it looks at like how and why people lie and why people cheat. And it was just made me start to reflect upon my own behaviors, not saying that I lie and cheat all the time, but just how people think about things. I've now ordered a book called Lying by Sam Harris because it's a topic I want to explore more. And so even though I'm not religious or I don't belong to a faith-based community, I'm trying to do things in my life that then reap the benefits that these communities can bring in terms of helping others or having values or those sort of things. So the final thing I just want to say before I wrap this up is that there is another study that has found a lot of really similar results to the blue zones. It's detailed in a book called Aging with Grace, the Nun Study and the Science of Old Aging. And nuns make like perfect subjects for studies because so many of the variables of life are removed. Like they keep very similar routines, they eat similar foods, they don't smoke, they're celibate, they have similar jobs and similar health care for most of their lives. And the religious groups keep these really extensive membership lists and historical records, making them a very perfect way to track information going back like decades and decades. And really outside of a laboratory, you'd be hard pressed to find a more pure environment for doing some research. So a lot of the book focuses on Alzheimer's and why some nuns in the case of the book, but why some people get it and why some people don't. But what is interesting is like how many of the nuns are then also living to be 100 or at least well into their 90s. And when you then look at the way that they're living and the stuff that they're doing, so much of it then resonates with the principles set out as part of the blue zones. So they belong to a faith-based community. They have a real strong sense of purpose. They are eating simple, unprocessed foods. They have a very supportive tribe that keeps them doing these same things. They regularly use prayer as a way of like relaxing and unwinding. So it's just really another setting that goes to support the principles and the research behind the blue zones and why these can be then so important. So that is it for this week's show. There should hopefully be some things that you can start to be including in your daily or your weekly practices, or resources that you can start to check out to explore this more, whether it be like some of the books or the documentaries or the podcasts or whatnot that I've mentioned. Next week, I will be back with another guest. But in the meantime, look after yourself and I will join you soon.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.